Hello everyone. Thanks for taking time out to join our webinar today. The biggest cyber threat in 2020? Your employees. My name is Tim Sadler. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Tessian. We're a technology company building the world's first human layer security platform to protect people using email. At the end of today's webinar, I'm also going to be joined by another Tim Fitzgerald, who's the Chief Information Security Officer at Arm, one of the world's largest chip manufacturers, and also a Tessian customer. So what can you expect to learn from today's webinar? First, I'm going to talk through the history of cybersecurity and why data breaches are at an all-time high. I'll then talk about human layer security, what this new paradigm of security is and why it's going to become a critical component of every business's security strategy. And finally, I'll talk about Tessian and how we're using machine learning to help businesses automatically protect their people using email. We'll conclude the webinar with a Q&A session between myself and Tim Fitzgerald. Tim's going to be sharing his insights and expertise into how Arm think about securing the human layer of their organization, why people using email is such a big risk, and how they're using Tessian to address this risk. So without further ado, let's kick off. Part 1. Why are data breaches at an all-time high? It will probably come as no shock to anyone who's joined this webinar that there's been a surge in the volume of cyber attacks and data breaches in recent years. This has increased the cost for organizations who are having to deal with these issues, and Accenture's annual research into the cost of cybercrime tells us that for the average company, there's been a 67% increase in the volume of security breaches over the past 5 years. The number is alarming, but as I said, I'm sure you all know this. What many of us don't know, though, is why are things trending this way? It's not like we haven't been trying to keep our organization secure. In fact, every one of our organizations most likely has a cybersecurity strategy for how we protect ourselves against exactly this kind of risk. But the big problem is that our definition, way of thinking, and strategy for cybersecurity is out of date. We see the textbook definition of cybersecurity here, leading with the protection of networks, devices, and data. And that's exactly what we've been doing, focusing on machines and systems, but not our people. Today, your employees now control your most sensitive systems and data. It might be John in your finance department who has control over data like company financial accounts and banking information, or control over systems like your billing and banking platforms. It could be Julia in your HR department who has control over data like employee social security numbers and compensation data, and is also in control of systems like your HR and payroll platforms. Our organizations are only as secure as the people who are the gatekeepers to these digital systems and data. We call this the human layer. So back to our original question, why are data breaches on the rise? And hopefully you see where I'm going with this. It's because today, data breaches are being caused by people. The reason why? It's because people have 3 significant security vulnerabilities. We call these human layer vulnerabilities. The first is that people break the rules. They ignore security policies, they steal company data, they don't change passwords. The second is that people make mistakes. They accidentally leak data or accidentally misconfigure systems. The third is that people are easily hacked. They can be easily deceived and coerced by attackers, especially on email. Now let's look a little closer at these vulnerabilities through the lens of some real-life examples. So first up, a real-life example of someone breaking the rules. In 2017, a private healthcare provider suffered a data breach after one of their employees stole customer records and offered them for sale on the dark web. This particular incident really underlines how reliant our security strategies are on our employees doing the right thing 100% of the time, and how bad it can be when things go wrong. Now, this breach was nothing sophisticated. It was as simple as an employee downloading bulk reports from their CRM platform and then sending these reports to their personal email account. The data lost included names, email addresses, dates of birth, and nationality. And this incident resulted in the UK regulator for data protection, the Information Commissioner's Office, fining the company over $200,000. It's worth noting that this was a pre-GDPR fine. It's possible fines for this kind of thing today would be much higher. Now let's take a look at a real-life example of people making mistakes. In what was one of the biggest breaches of the past year, a major credit card provider lost 100 million customer credit card applications and accounts. Many people likely heard about this incident and have read that a hacker gained access to this data. It's correct that this did happen. The data was stolen by a hacker. But what led to the breach happening in the first place was employee human error. Someone misconfigured a firewall, which allowed attackers to gain access to the data within an S3 bucket of the company's Amazon Web Services environment. Without this employee mistake, the attack wouldn't have been possible. And the company has since reported that they expect this data breach to cost them as much as $500 million. And so finally, let's take a look at an example of a security breach caused by people being hacked. In 2018, the Dutch operation of a French film company was the victim of a targeted spear phishing attack. Using a very common technique, attackers spoofed the email address of the CEO before emailing the finance director explaining they were in acquisition talks with a Dubai-based company. What's particularly remarkable about this wasn't a single instance of trickery, but instead communication over an extended period of time, which resulted in the finance director wiring multiple sums of money to a bank account controlled by the hackers. In the end, the company lost a total of 19 million euros, and the CEO and finance director of the Dutch operation were both held responsible and fired. So, as we finish part 1 of this webinar, just to recap, data breaches are on the rise. They're being caused by people. And the big problem is that even though all of our organizations have a cybersecurity strategy in place, it's out of date. In the 90s, it was about protecting the network, and now we all have firewalls. Last decade, it was about protecting devices, and now we all have EDR platforms. But now we must protect people. Human layer security is the third paradigm of cybersecurity, and this decade we need to incorporate this into our cybersecurity strategy. So let's move on to part 2. What is human layer security? The human layer of an organization uses many different platforms and interfaces. This ranges from someone in finance using email to communicate and share data with people inside and outside the organization, or someone in HR using a web browser to access cloud platforms and websites. Or it could be someone in sales using Excel to manipulate and analyze customer data. But the problem is when people interact so frequently with so many different interfaces, human error can lead to a security breach. That's why human layer security is needed to secure countless human digital interactions that happen every day in the workplace. As a security team, what options do we have to help secure our employees? Let's talk through some of the legacy approaches to human layer security. These are 4 of the most common approaches organizations are trying to use today to practice human layer security. The first up is removal, simply trying to keep people secure by removing their access to digital systems and data. The second is policies, telling people how to be secure by telling them what they can and can't or should and shouldn't do when interacting with these interfaces. The third is training. This might be something like a phishing simulation or an e-learning platform. We're trying to educate people to be secure and do the right thing 100% of the time. And finally, we might be using some form of rule-based technology like a data loss prevention platform or a secure email gateway. But there's a problem with all of these approaches. Human layer security needs to balance both effectiveness of preventing security breaches caused by people, but also ensure that we don't impact the productivity of the very people we're trying to protect. You absolutely have to make sure there's an appropriate balance between the 2 of these criteria. Let's look at some examples. At the most extreme end, we could simply remove an employee's access to data and systems. Whilst this might be effective at preventing security breaches potentially caused by John, it's completely untenable as he can no longer do his job. I'm sure no one would agree that this is a realistic solution. So let's look at another option. We could remind John of the company data protection policy. This will require no more than 5 minutes of their time to refresh their memory of the policy, but it's largely ineffective. There's no guarantee he will read and retain the information. Third, we could rely on training. We could have John complete phishing simulation exercises every few months, but it's not guaranteed that it would lead to long-term behavior change. Plus, it's impossible to entirely train away the risk of human error. We might try and use a rule-based technology, like our data loss prevention platform, to create a policy which tries to prevent an employee from breaking the rules by blocking his ability to send emails to an @gmail.com domain. Because DLP and other legacy technologies only allow for blunt, basic rules, these are also really ineffective at keeping people secure. For example, by blocking @gmail.com, he might not be able to email some members of the deal team who use those accounts, which impedes his productivity and does nothing to stop him sending sensitive data to his non-Gmail personal accounts. All of these legacy options to human layer security are failing to meet the minimum viable criteria. They're ineffective and limit the productivity of employees. Human layer security isn't trivial, and in the same way that we use advanced technology to protect our networks and devices, we need to use advanced technology to protect our people. Machine learning is the only viable method of securing the human layer. It's both highly effective and has minimal impact on the productivity of your people. And this is exactly the kind of technology we're building at Tessian. We secure people using email in a way that is highly effective at preventing people breaking the rules, making mistakes, and being hacked. And when it comes to human digital interfaces, email is the highest risk interface that your employees interact with. Email is the main artery of communication for the human layer and a channel through which some of the most sensitive information in an organization is shared. And finally, because email is decentralized and open by nature, it's easy for attackers to target your employees with spear phishing emails. It's no wonder that $26 billion has been lost to business email compromise scams since 2016, according to the FBI. And misdirected emails, which are emails sent to the wrong recipients by mistake, were the number one data security incident reported to the Information Commissioner's Office under GDPR. Human error in email is a major security threat to your organization. So how do you address the risk of human error within email? Tessian uses machine learning algorithms which analyze historical email data to learn the difference between normal email activity and email activity that looks like a security threat. Let's look at how we use this intelligence to protect outbound emails. Tessian is always on and working away in the background. The employee isn't even aware that it's there. Every time they draft an outgoing email and hit send, Tessian performs an analysis of the outgoing email within 500 milliseconds. We analyze things like who the email is being sent to, the content within the email and whether we think this looks appropriate for the recipient, who you're addressing the email to, and the attachment and its content. Tessian's machine intelligence then concludes whether the email is okay to send or whether it looks like it might be being sent to the wrong person, based on an understanding of what kind of content and communication patterns you've had with these recipients previously. If Tessian thinks the employee is making a mistake, we then show them a notification. We've built our machine learning technology in a way that it's possible to explain the specific reason we think an error is taking place, so they can make the right decision by understanding the context. Tessian addresses the 3 key security vulnerabilities of people using email through 3 modules: Enforcer, Guardian, and Defender. Tessian Enforcer ensures that people don't break the rules by automatically preventing employees from exfiltrating sensitive data to personal email accounts. Tessian Guardian ensures people don't make mistakes by automatically preventing employees from accidentally sending highly sensitive information to the wrong person. And Tessian Defender ensures that people aren't hacked by automatically detecting spear phishing emails and other impersonation attacks. So as we approach the final Q&A session of this webinar, I'm just going to recap on what we've discussed and learned today. In part 1, we learned that human error is the number 1 cause of data breaches because people break the rules, people make mistakes, and people can be hacked. In part 2, we learned that our cybersecurity strategy now needs to focus on protecting people and that machine learning is the enabling technology. In part 3, we outlined that email is the major human layer security risk for most organizations today. Tessian is deployed across world-leading organizations as a core part of their human layer security strategy. One of these customers, Arm, is using Tessian Guardian and Tessian Defender to secure their employees using email and prevent the risks of accidental data loss and spear phishing.
So to open this final part of the webinar, I'm delighted to introduce Arm's Chief Information Security Officer, Tim Fitzgerald, who's kindly shared some of his time to have a Q&A session with us. As a reminder, we're taking questions from the audience as well, so please feel free to submit questions in the Q&A panel. So let's kick off. Tim, could you please give a brief introduction of who you are and your role at Arm?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. So I've been with Arm for just a little bit more than 2 years now, and I am the first Chief Information Security Officer that Arm has had, which represents a whole unique set of challenges that I've not encountered before in my career. But prior to Arm, I was the Chief Security Officer at Symantec, which many of you will be familiar with, for just a little bit more than 5 years. And so moving over to Arm, I have a slightly more narrow scope of responsibility at Arm, where I am responsible for all of our digital data and people security, excluding physical security, and am working with the business to take Arm, a fairly big technology company, from so you might expect them to be quite mature, but taking them from what was sort of their historical legacy around security, which was very focused on kind of the network perimeter layer of security, through to a more modern and more appropriate level of security for a company like Arm. Everything from how do we protect our critical digital assets to how do we protect our people, all the way to how do we navigate various regulatory and trade compliance issues, and be able to deliver what is considered to be protected intellectual property to customers that sit in regulated regions. It's a very interesting role, and in particular, for those of you who are not familiar with Arm, they're a pretty special company in a number of respects, and certainly in the UK they stand out as a very big tech company. But one of the things that's quite unique to Arm is the focus on the people experience of our employees. Not to say that other companies do not focus on that, but Arm, this is part of the ethos in a very, very deep way, that we believe that our people are good, and we believe that they're trustworthy, and we believe that information sharing at scale is the source of our innovation. So if you can imagine putting yourself in the position of trying to be responsible for security of an organization of 7,000 plus people who inherently believe that we should share everything, there's a whole bunch of risk in there associated with human security. And actually, this is what engendered the conversation with Tessian outside, over and above our use of the product, which we like very much. The dialogue around what Tessian might be able to know, based on the context and information they have around how people use email, which, as was rightly pointed out in the recorded session there, is where people spend the majority of our time and where the majority of our risk comes from. It's a really interesting potential offering to think about how we layer in that level of contextual knowledge into our overall human security strategy.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thanks for sharing that with us, Tim. As the CISO of Arm, then, what are some of the biggest challenges that you face, and how does that affect the way you think about your security strategy?
Yeah, so the challenge, I guess our challenges are, not to be trite, but they're sort of opportunities as well. By far the biggest single challenge we have is Arm's ethos around information sharing. As I noted before, we have a belief, and I think it has proven out to be true over the 30 plus years that Arm has been in business, that their level of information sharing has allowed Arm to be extraordinarily successful and innovative. So there's no backing up from that as an ethos of the company. But that represents a huge amount of challenge, because we give a tremendous amount of personal freedom for how people can access our information and our systems, as well as how they use our data to share both with internally with our peers, but also with our customers who we're very deeply embedded with. We don't sell a traditional product where they buy it, we deliver it to them, and then we're done. The vast majority of our customers spend years with us developing their own product based on our intellectual property. And so that the level of information sharing that happens in a relationship like that is quite difficult to manage, actually, to be candid.
Yeah, really sounds like you've been balancing or having to think about not just the effectiveness of your security strategy or your systems, but also that impact to productivity of employees. So has human layer security been part of your strategy for a long time at Arm, or even in your career before Arm?
My career before Arm at Symantec, Symantec was a very different company, more of a traditional software sales company. It also had 25,000 people who thought they knew more about security than I did. So that presented a unique challenge in terms of how we worked with that community. But even at Symantec, I was thinking quite hard about how we influence behavior. And ultimately, what it comes down to for me is I view my job in human layer security is somewhere between a sociology and a marketing experiment, right? We're really trying to change people's behavior in a moment, not universally, not their personal ethos, but will they make the right decision in this moment to do something that won't create security risk for us? And I kind of label that sort of microtransactions. We get these small moments in time where we have an opportunity to interact with and influence behavior. And I've been sort of evolving that strategy as I've thought about it with ARM in a very different place in many respects, but trying to think about not just how we influence their behavior in that moment in time, but actually, can we change their ethos? Can we make responsible security decision making part of everybody's job? And I know that there's not a single security person on this call who would say they're not trying to do that, right? But actually, that turns out to be a very, very hard problem. And I think the way that we think about this in ARM is that we have, a centralized security team. I guess ultimately security is my responsibility at ARM, but we very much rely on what we consider to be our extended security team, which is all of our employees. Essentially, our view is that they can undo all of the good that we do behind them to try and compensate for the risk that normal human behavior creates. But I think one of the things that's unique about how we look at it this ARM is, we very much take the people are people view in this. Not that they're the weakest link, not that they don't come with good intent or they don't want to be good at their job or that they're going to take shortcuts just to get that extra moment of productivity, but actually that everybody wants to do a good job. And our job is to arm them with both the knowledge and the tools to be able to keep themselves secure rather than trying to secure around them. Yeah. Candidly, just to finish that thought, Tim, just candidly, we do both, right? I mean, we're not going to stop doing all the other stuff we do to kind of help protect our people in ways that they don't even know exist. But the idea for us here is actually that we have rare opportunities to empower our employees to take care of themselves. One of the things we really like about Tessian is this is something we've done for our employees, not to our employees. It's a tool that is meant to keep them out of trouble.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point, Tim. And, I think a lot of what you're talking about here as well is just security culture and really establishing a great security culture as a company. And I love that for employees rather than to employees. I mean, it sounds like this really, you have to, at the core of the organization, be thinking about the concept of human error in the right way when thinking about security decision making. I guess thinking that people are always going to make mistakes, and as you said, it's just because they are people. Could you maybe walk us through a bit more about how you think, or what advice you might have for some of the other organizations that are on the line today about how they might talk to their boards or their other teams about rationalizing this risk internally and working with the fact that our employees are only human?
Yeah. It's actually for me, this has been the most productive dialogue we've had with our board and our executive around security. I think most of you on the phone will recognize that when you go in and you start talking about the various technical layers that we have that are available to protect our systems, the eyes glaze over pretty quickly, and they really just want to know whether or not it works. The human security problem is one that you can get a lot of passion on, in parts because I think it's an unrecognized risk in the boardroom that while the insider, meaning sort of the traditional insider threat that we think about, which is a person who's really acting against our best interest, can be very, very impactful. At least at ARM, and certainly in my prior career, the vast majority of issues that we have and that have caused us harm over the last several years have been people who do not wish us harm. They've been people just trying to do their job and making mistakes or doing the wrong thing, making a bad decision at a moment in time, and trying to figure out how we help them not to do that. is a much more difficult problem than trying to figure out how to put in a firewall or put in DLP. So we really try and separate that conversation. There are a lot of things we do to try and catch that person who is truly acting against our best interest. But that actually, in many ways, that is a totally different problem than at ARM, what accounts for more than 70% of our incidents and certainly more than 90% of our loss scenarios is people just doing the wrong thing and making the wrong decision, not that they were actively seeking to cause harm. And if I might just give a couple of examples, because I think it helps bring it home.
Sure.
The two most impactful events that we've had in the last 2 years at ARM was somebody in our royalties group. We sell software, right? So every time somebody produces a chip, we get paid. So that's a good thing for ARM. But having somebody's royalty forecast gives you a really good sense of what markets they intend to enter and where they intend to go as a company. And most of our customers compete with each other because they're all selling similar chips, software design into various formats. So having one customer having somebody else's data would be hugely impactful. And in fact, that's exactly what we did not that long ago is somebody, one of our royalty people pulled down some pertinent information for a customer into a spreadsheet and then fat-fingered an email and sent it to the wrong customer, right? They sent it to Joan at customer X instead of Joan at customer Y. That turned out to be a hugely impactful event for us as a company because this was a major relationship and because we essentially disclose strategic roadmap from one customer to another. Completely avoidable scenario, and in a situation where that employee was trying to do their best for their customer and ultimately made a mistake.
I think thanks for sharing that example with us. I think it's a really, really good point. I think for a long time in security, we were talking about insider threat and people immediately think about malicious employees or malicious insiders. And I think it's absolutely true what you say that, the reality is that most of your employees are, trustworthy and want to do the right thing, but they sometimes make mistakes. And when you're doing something as often as, say, sending an email or sharing data, the errors can be disastrous and they can be frequent as well. Yeah. And I think about it a lot. And
that last part, Tim, is the frequency that really gets us, right? So insider threat, that really bad guy who's acting against our best interest. We have a whole bunch of other mechanisms that, while still hard, we have some other mechanisms to try and find them. That's infrequent, high impact. What we're finding is that the person who makes a mistake is high frequency, medium to high impact. And so we're getting hammered on that kind of stuff. And the reason we came to Tessian in the first place was to address that exact issue. And it's one of the reasons that I'm on this call, right? Is I really believe in where you guys are going in terms of trying to address the risk associated with people making bad choices versus acting against our interest.
This concept of high frequency, I think, is super interesting. And one of the questions I was actually going to ask you was around that, it's almost like in security, hackers and cyber attacks get all the attention because these are the scary things. And naturally, it's what, boards want to talk about and executives want to talk about. And almost accidents seem less scary, so they get less focus. But this frequency point of how often we share data, we send emails, it has analogies in other parts of our lives as well, with like, we don't think twice before we get in a car, but actually, it's very easy to, have human error there, and things can also be really bad. Do you think that we need to do more to educate our boards, our executive teams, and our employees to actually sort of open their eyes to the fact that inadvertent human error or accidents can be just as damaging as attackers or cyber attacks?
Yeah, it depends on your organization, but I would suggest that generally we do need to do more. We, as an industry, we've had a lot of amazing things to talk about to get our board's attention over the last 10 years. These major events and loss scenarios, often perpetrated by big hacking groups, sometimes nation sponsored. It is very sexy security to talk about that kind of stuff and use that as justification for the reason we need to invest in security. And actually, there's a lot of legitimacy behind that, right? It's not that that's fake messaging. It's just one part of the narrative. The other side of the narrative that we spend more time on now than that sort of nation state type threat is trying to remove what our CEO calls trying to remove the footfalls, right? Let's not do it to ourselves. Because what we're finding is not only by frequency, but by impact right now, the vast majority of what we're dealing with is avoidable events based on human error. and perhaps predictable human error. I guess that's the point I want to kind of hone in on. Is it's I very much chafe at the idea that we think of our employees as the weakest link, right? I think it sort of underserves people's intent and how they would choose to operate. So rather than that, we try and take a look in the mirror and say, what are we not providing these people in order to help them avoid these type of scenarios? And I think if you change your perspective on that, rather than sort of people are an intractable problem and therefore we can't conquer this, if we start thinking about how do we mobilize them as part of our overall cybersecurity strategy and defense mechanisms, it causes you to rethink whether or not you're serving your populace correctly. And I think in general, not only should we be talking to our senior executives and boards more clearly about where real risk exists, which for most companies is right in this zone, but we need to be doing more to help those people combat that rather than just sort of, I think casting blame that the average employee is not trustworthy or will do the wrong thing. I'm an optimist, so I genuinely believe that's not true. I think if we give people the opportunity to make a good decision and we make the easiest path to get their job done, the secure path, they will take it. That is our job as security professionals.
Yeah, I think the huge point there, and the word that was jumping out for me is this concept of empowerment. And I think about it is strange sometimes when you look at a lot of security initiatives that companies deploy, how we almost don't factor in that concept of the impact we'll have on an employee's productivity. And I guess at Tessian, we're great believers that the greatest technology we've created has really empowered society, so it's made people's lives better, and we think that security technology should not only keep people safe, but it should do it in a way that empowers them to do their best work as well. And maybe on that note, Tim, I can shift gears slightly and just dig in a little bit more to actually how ARM specifically are using Tessian's human layer security platform today.
Yeah, we have a couple. So we are currently using both. Correct me here, Tim. I always get the names mixed up. So you'll have to correct me. But we are currently using both Defender and Guardian.
That's correct.
In their full form. Which I think the original use case we brought in Tessian was to try and stop people from sending the right information to the wrong people or the wrong information to the right people, right? And I think it's proven to be very highly effective in helping us do that. In fact, not only have we seen a massive reduction in the number of events and the impact of that due to deploying this technology, we're starting to learn. Perhaps the more interesting part is we're starting to learn about patterns and behaviors of individuals in the organization. Those people who click through and say, yes, I want to send it anyway, even when Tessian's popping up and saying, don't do this, there's something wrong. It's giving us really targeted opportunities to engage with individuals to find out what's motivating them to take that step. Is it really just carelessness? Do they not believe the technology? What is it that motivates them to take that, in this case, even take an additional step to do something that potentially is harmful to us when we've given them tools to help themselves. So that is proving to be really interesting for us. And then, in fact, I think we've had a tremendous success story in terms of reducing the number of events that happen in full, but also being able to engage what I would consider to be our highest risk population of people, those folks who have demonstrated behavior that they will go around controls. And if nothing else, that is tremendously valuable to us. We're exploring Enforcer. I think the idea that I think we all understand that people take data with them when they leave, and they perhaps while they're employed here, right? But there's a big and I don't think we're going to stop that. But there's a big difference between somebody taking a spreadsheet because they built some cool macros and they want to be able to use that at their next job, and somebody taking a spreadsheet full of PII that might cause massive issues if it were disclosed. And so trying to figure out with Enforcer, how do we get really focused in on the stuff that matters? It's sort of like the DLP problem, although in a slightly different form.
Yeah.
Is false positives can be the enemy in this type of scenario. And so trying to make sure that we can get honed in on exactly the type of data or exactly the type of extraction that we're looking for, that's the secret sauce. And I think we're still exploring how do we do that successfully to make this as effective as possible.
No, completely understood. And I was actually just going to drill in a little bit more on that point. So you spoke about data loss prevention platforms. When you were sort of thinking about how to solve this problem of inadvertent human error on email, people sending emails to the wrong people, or dealing with the issue of phishing and spear phishing, what consideration did you have of like the other solutions that were out there? You know, what did Tessian address for you that you couldn't quite address with those other platforms?
Yeah, couple of things. So coming from Symantec, as you might expect, I used all of their technology extensively, and one of the best products Symantec has to offer is their DLP solution. So I'm very, very familiar with that, and I would argue we had one of the more advanced installations in the world running internally at Symantec. So I'm extremely familiar with the capability of those technologies. I think what I learned in my time in doing that is when used correctly against sort of a finite environment, a finite data set, that type of solution can be very, very effective of kind of keeping that data where it's supposed to be and understanding movement in that ecosystem. When you try and deploy that broadly, it has all the same problems as everything else. Is that you start to run into the inability of the DLP system to understand where that data is supposed to be. Is this person supposed to have it based on their role and their function? It's not a smart technology like that. So you end up trying to write these very, very complex rules that are hard to manage. What I liked about Tessian is it gave us an opportunity to use the machine learning in the background to try and develop context about whether or not something that somebody was doing was either atypical or perhaps just by the very nature, maybe it's not atypical, maybe it's actually part of a bad process, but by the very nature of the type of information they're sending around and the characteristics of that information, we can get a sense of whether or not what they're doing is causing us risk. So it doesn't require us to be completely prescriptive about what we're looking for. It allows us to learn with the technology and with the people on what normal patterns of behavior look like, and therefore intervene when it matters, and not sort of having to react every time an alert bell goes off. So, we to be clear, we still use DLP in limited circumstances, but what we found is that was not a really viable option for us, particularly in the email stream, to be able to accurately identify when people were doing things that were risky versus moving a very specific data set that we didn't want them to.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And then if you're thinking about the future and sort of, what you hope Tessian can actually become, where does it go from here? What's the opportunity for Tessian as a human layer security platform?
Yeah, I recall back to talking to you guys kind of, I guess, last spring, and one of the things I was poking at was you have all this amazing context of what people are doing in email, and that's where people spend most of their time, and it's where most of the risk comes from for most organizations. So how can we turn that into beyond just making sure someone doesn't fat finger an email address, or they're not sending a sensitive file where it's not supposed to go, or the other use cases that come along with Tessian? Can we take the context that we're gaining through how people are using email and creating more of those moments in time to connect with them, become more predictive, where we start to see patterns of behavior of individuals that would suggest to us that they are either susceptible to certain types of risk, or are likely to take a particular action in the future. There's a tremendous amount of knowledge that can be derived from that context, particularly if you start thinking about how you can put that together with what would traditionally be kind of the behavioral analytics or the UEBA type space. Can we start to mesh together what we know about the technology and the machines with real human behavior, and therefore have a very good picture that would help us not only to find those actual bad guys who are in our environment that we know are there, but also to get out in front of people's behavior rather than reacting to it after it happened. That for me, that's kind of the holy grail of what this could become, is to get, if not predictive, at least start leading us towards where we think risk exists and allowing us an opportunity to intervene before things happen.
That's great, Tim. Thanks so much for sharing that with us. That actually brings us to the end of today's webinar. So Tim, I'd really like to thank you for sharing those insights with us and also taking the time to be on the call with us today. I also want to thank all of our audience members for joining and submitting questions. Our team will respond directly to any unanswered questions. We actually ran out of time there at the end, so we will get back to you on those. And also, if you have any other questions you'd like to ask, you can email me directly. My email address is here, or you can also email our team at communications@tessian.com. So thank you all, and we'll have more webinars upcoming soon that will communicate to you all soon.